In 1919, America's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, recalled what happened to the Armenians in 1915. When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. 105 years ago today, the calculated project by the Ottoman Empire to rid the world of the Armenian race began. By the time it was over, the lives of 1.5 million Armenian children, women and men were lost. Another 1 million Assyrian and Greek lives were also taken by the same perpetrator for the same xenophobic reasons. These millions of people had properties that were confiscated, valuables that were stolen, businesses that were occupied, communities that were ruined, churches that were appropriated. This destruction, along with the deaths, are why that word genocide is so important to us as descendants of survivors of 1915. Because genocide is a word that was designed to characterize the crime that was committed against our great-grandparents, grandparents and parents. A crime, like all crimes, which demands justice. And this is why our community focuses a good portion of its advocacy efforts on informing political leaders in Canberra and other capital cities around Australia about the importance of recognising the Armenian Genocide. Recognition by Australia and her states is about what we can do in pursuit for justice for the Armenian Genocide. As for the status of the Australian government's position on the Armenian Genocide, it is kind of a Houdini act that attempts an array of verbal gymnastics and poorly veiled illusion. All these euphemisms, all this effort to not upset a dictatorship posing as a friendly ally.
Dedeleriniz geldiler. Burada olduğumuzu gördüler. Sonra da kimi ayakları üzerinde, kimi tabutla geri döndüler. Şayet aynı niyetle gelecekseniz sizi de bekleriz. Sizleri de dedeleriniz gibi uğurlayacağımızdan hiç şüpheniz olmasın.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has legislated an increase to his power since an attempted coup in 2016, effectively rendering him Turkey's dictator and ensuring full control over the country's judiciary. The man Australia looks to appease, with a position of indifference on such a blatant crime against humanity, has used his self-gifted powers over the last 4 years to jail over 150,000 state officials, teachers, bureaucrats and academics, arrest over 96,000 of his own citizens in connection with the coup plot, shut down over 3,000 schools, dormitories and universities, sack over 6,000 academics, fire over 4,000 judges and prosecutors, close down over 180 media outlets and arrest over 300 journalists. On the Armenian Genocide, this same autocratic leader applies foreign pressure on Australia by threatening to close Gallipoli every time a legislature moves towards recognition, using the graves of our Anzac soldiers as bargaining chips to stop Australia from acting responsibly. In 2013, the Turkish consul in Sydney admitted New South Wales politicians who recognised the genocides would not be welcome in Turkey for the Anzac Day centenary commemorations.
And the Turkish state has hit back with a threat to the one event that has for decades now underpinned our close diplomatic relations. A Foreign Ministry statement says the proponents of this motion will no longer be welcome at the Gallipoli commemorations.
These persons who try to damage the spirit of Çanakkale Gallipoli will also not have their place in the Çanakkale ceremonies, where we commemorate our sons lying side by side in our soil.
The local council at Gallipoli has also made it clear that critics will not be welcome at the centenary celebrations in 2015.
We announced to the public that we will not forgive those who are behind these decisions and that we do not want to see them in Çanakkale anymore.
So the Premier and members of the Parliament will not be welcome at the 2015 celebrations?
Well, I think one should read the press statement of our ministry carefully. So.
Well, the press statement says they won't be welcome, so one would assume that they won't be given the visas to go.
Yes.
And last year, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who in 2011 called for Australian recognition of the Armenian Genocide, sensationally admitted to bowing down to Turkey's Gallipoli threats when explaining his backflip, saying, "We've been working closely with the Turkish government to ensure that we continue to have a very strong relationship that enables Australians to make that pilgrimage." This position has not been updated for 2020. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, an illusionary alliance with what is an autocratic and disrespectful Turkey is one reason that Australia's position on the Armenian Genocide is untenable. Also making Australia's position untenable are the facts that you have already heard tonight. Stephen Colbert puts untenable best when he says, in order to maintain an untenable position, you have to be actively ignorant. Keep your facts, I'm going with the truth. The truth that Australia is going with is that the Armenian experience at the hands of the Ottoman Empire was not genocide. An active ignorance of the overwhelming facts. This is clearly offensive and unacceptable to us as descendants of survivors who proudly call Australia home. We are also proud because furthering the notion that this position is untenable is the country's politics. The number of federal Australian politicians who actively distance themselves from the official position and call on Australia to unequivocally recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides continues to grow. In recent years, there have been over 20 members from the current parliament that have stood in their chambers on over 40 occasions to call on Australia to recognise the Armenian genocide. If you count those no longer in parliament, those numbers significantly increase. In 2019, the first federal-led Australian delegation visited Armenia, paid their respects at the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, and planted a tree thanking the Australians who came to the aid of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks in 1915. In February this year, the advocacy arms of the Armenian Australian, Assyrian Australian and Greek Australian communities launched the Joint Justice Initiative, which affirms the advocacy priority of these three influential communities for this 46th term of Parliament was seeing the Armenian Genocide recognised by Australia. The Joint Justice Initiative now has a dozen signed affirmations of support from current federal parliamentarians who are backing the initiative. This list includes a current minister, government and opposition MPs as well as crossbench supporters. The Australian Greens, Centre Alliance and the Qatar Australia Party all back the call for Australia to recognise the Armenian Genocide. When the elected representatives in a democracy are increasingly declaring a position that differs to that of the government, it is time that the government reviews and changes their position. It is likely that it is outdated. It is probable that it is wrong. It is definitive that it is indefensible and therefore untenable. We are proud to announce that this week, the peak public affairs body of the Jewish Australian community, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and the New South Wales Ecumenical Council added their significant voices to calls for Australian recognition of the Armenian Genocide. Voices that already include the Australian Christian Lobby and the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Prominent voices in the Australian media, including the country's highest rating radio broadcaster Alan Jones, have started calling the government's position on the Armenian Genocide what it is: untenable. Adding to this sentiment of untenability, in late 2019, the United States Congress recognised the Armenian Genocide through resolutions in both their House of Representatives and Senate. The threats by the Turkish state against Australian recognition, minuscule compared to those Ankara had made against Washington. It didn't stop them from acting for truth and justice, exposing the Turkish bluff of retaliation. It shouldn't stop Australia from doing the same. The grassroots prioritisation of this issue by our community and our ability to constantly renew our fight for justice through generations and technology and through programs like the Armenian National Committee of Australia's Youth Advocates means we will see this battle against the untenable through to the day we chaperone Australia to the position of truth and justice on the Armenian Genocide. Thank you to the Armenian Australian community for your continued and steadfast support of advocacy in the name of human rights. We remember, we demand.